Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with the Supreme Court decision that could reshape the 2024 presidential race and alter the limits of presidential power well beyond this year. The justices ruled in a 6-3 vote that former President Donald Trump has some immunity from criminal charges over his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Last night, President Biden went before the cameras at the White House to say the high court set a dangerous precedent.
No one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. With today's Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that fundamentally changed. For all practical purposes, today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what a president can do.
And now President Biden says it's up to voters to render a judgment on Trump and decide whether his actions on January 6th make him unfit for office.
Well, now, Nathan, former President Trump is looking to take his victory at the Supreme Court into New York. His lawyers have taken the first steps to have his criminal hush money convictions tossed out now that the high court has found he has substantial immunity. Trump is due for sentencing next week on the 34 felony counts. His legal team is asking for a delay to allow time for briefing and arguments.
And sticking with presidential politics, Karen, the Democratic National Committee is now considering formally nominating Joe Biden as early as this month, nearly a month before their convention. Bloomberg's Amy Morris reports from Washington.
The strategy is to ensure that President Biden is on November ballots and stamp out any intra-party chatter of replacing Biden after last week's poor debate performance. A potential date for Biden's nomination is July 21st, when the Democratic Convention's Credentials Committee meets virtually. That's according to people familiar with the matter who spoke on condition of anonymity. The panel is meeting to finalize procedures before the party's convention in Chicago starts August 19th. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
Amy, thank you. Well, despite Biden's debate performance, the president's campaign says it raised $127 million in June. The haul is the Biden campaign's best fundraising month of the election cycle. Biden aides have pointed to their ability to rake in cash despite his performance as evidence the president retained his party support and had not irrevocably damaged his campaign.
Let's turn to politics overseas now, Karen. French President Emmanuel Macron's centrist alliance and the left-wing New Popular Front are considering pulling candidates from the second round of parliamentary voting in a bid to stop the far right. The National Rally and its allies won the largest share of the vote in the first round with just over 33%. Now, an outright majority for Marine Le Pen's party or a hung parliament are the most likely eventualities. Alan Katz is Bloomberg's bureau chief in Paris.
If you're the financial markets, your best case scenario is nothing happens over the next 3 years. This is very hard for French people to accept. The idea that you might spend a long time not legislating, not really doing anything. It's very different. You know, if you're American, you're like, well, actually, that's the way it's been for much of the time for the last 20 or 30 years. But here it's not. France is sort of a semi-presidential, semi-parliamentary system. Usually, the government, that's the executive branch, has a majority in parliament and can basically pass whatever they want.
Bloomberg Paris bureau chief Alan Katz says the second round of voting takes place Sunday. Stocks in France are lower this morning. They've now wiped out nearly all of yesterday's gains.
Well, here in the U.S., Nathan, futures are lower ahead of the session on Wall Street. Automakers will be in focus with car makers releasing monthly sales data. Analysts are expecting Tesla to report another quarter of weakening sales, and Dan Ives covers the EV maker for Wedbush Securities.
I think Tesla beats whisper numbers, 415K, 420, and this marks what I believe is the worst is in the rearview mirror. The comeback story for Musk and Tesla has begun, which is why we see a bull case for the stock going into the next 6 months.
Wedbush's Dan Ives has a $275 price target for Tesla. The stock trading around $208 this morning.
And Microsoft will begin today's session at all-time highs, Karen. As a result, Steve Ballmer has now passed Bill Gates as the sixth richest person in the world. We get more from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
It is the first time that the former CEO of Microsoft has been wealthier than the company's co-founder. The move came as Microsoft shares rose to another record, bringing their total gain this year to 21%. The company, through its partnership with OpenAI, has been one of the biggest beneficiaries of the artificial intelligence rally that has powered the U.S. stock market higher. More than 90% of Ballmer's $157.2 billion net worth is in Microsoft shares, according to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Charlie, thank you. And we're also following shares of Paramount Global this morning. This after the New York Times reported Barry Diller is considering making an offer for control of the company. We get more from Bloomberg's Doug Krisner.
Diller's interest in Paramount is the latest twist in a complex and dramatic effort to sell the company. Last month, the deal seemed close with Skydance Media. Then talks between Skydance and Paramount's controlling shareholder, National Amusements, fell apart. It appears Diller's non-disclosure agreement with National Amusements was signed sometime after the Skydance deal fell through. Now, a bid to take control of Paramount would be a coda of sorts for Diller. He tried to acquire Paramount Pictures in the early 1990s, but he was outbid by Sumner Redstone, the media mogul whose daughter, Sherry, now controls the company through National Amusements. In New York, I'm Doug Krisner, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Doug, thank you. And shares of Paramount Global up almost 3% this morning. Time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. For that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Hurricane Beryl has strengthened to Category 5 status as it crosses islands in the southeastern Caribbean. It's the earliest Cat 5 hurricane in the Atlantic ever. Beryl ripped off doors, windows, and roofs in homes. Grenada's Prime Minister Dickon Mitchell said late last night that one person had died, and authorities had not been able to assess the situation on some hard-hit islands.
The expectation is that the damage in Carriacou and Petite Martinique is going to be extreme.
Early today, Beryl's winds increased to 165 miles per hour. It is forecast to pass near Jamaica tomorrow. A Massachusetts judge declared a mistrial in the case of Karen Reed, the woman accused of running over her boyfriend, a Boston police officer, with her SUV and leaving him to die in a snowstorm in 2022. Jurors were in their fifth day of deliberations when the four-person eventually told the judge that they hadn't reached a unanimous verdict. Judge Beverly Cannone.
To continue to deliberate would be futile and only serve to force us to compromise these deeply held beliefs.
Defense attorney Alan Jackson celebrated the decision outside the courthouse.
This is what it looks like when you bring false charges against an innocent person.
Reed must return to a Massachusetts courtroom later this month and stand trial for the death of Brian O'Keefe again. The Israeli army has ordered a mass evacuation of Palestinians from much of Gaza's second-largest city, Khan Yunis. The order is a sign that Israeli troops could soon return to the southern city. It is also indications that Hamas has regrouped there. We're learning several U.S. military bases across Europe were put under a heightened state of alert, a force protection condition, over the weekend. It is the second highest state of alert that applies when an incident occurs or intelligence is received indicating some form of terrorist action. Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh spoke during Monday's Pentagon briefing.
Not related to a single threat, but it was due to a combination of factors potentially impacting the safety and security of service members stationed in the European theater.
The Pentagon, Sabrina Singh, says the heightened alert was done out of an abundance of caution. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it. With the Bloomberg News Now, I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Karen.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update with John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. It's a busy day for the NBA champion Boston Celtics. First, they rewarded Derek White with a 4-year, $126 million extension, and then they rewarded Jason Tatum with a super max deal of 5 years, $315 million. So Tatum will make $63 million a year, most in history, and the Celtics have been put up for sale. Wyc Grousbeck became majority owner in 2002 with a purchase price of $360 million. The Celtics have been valued at $4.7 billion. Klay Thompson leaving the Warriors after 13 seasons and 4 championships. He's headed to Dallas, and Isaiah Hartenstein is leaving the Knicks, headed for Oklahoma City, which means the Knicks need a center. They may re-sign Precious Achiuwa. There's also NHL free agency, and among the signings, Steven Stamkos with Nashville. He had spent his entire 16-year career with Tampa Bay. Mets and Nationals, first to 4 in D.C., 3-3 in the 10th inning.
0-2 the count. Harvey ready. He delivers. Swung on, hit in the air, deep center field. Young drifting back to the warning track. Turns at the wall. Gone! Go ahead. 3-run home run. J.D. Martinez. 6-3 Mets in the 10th.
On WCBS, Mets weren't done. Francisco Alvarez, his first ever triple, scored another run, and then a 2-run homer by Jose Iglesias, and the Mets needed that because the Nats scored 4 in the bottom of the 10th. Mets won 9-7. They won without Brandon Nimmo. He fainted in his hotel room, suffered a gash on his head, but no concussion. Nimmo hopes to play tonight. In Kansas City, it was the end of group play in Copa America, and the U.S., after getting upset by Panama, had to win to advance. Lost 1-0 to Uruguay, who scored 66th minute. The U.S. is out. At Wimbledon, Arina Sabalenka seeded third with Drew with a shoulder injury. Opening day wins for Coco Gauff, Carlos Alcaraz, and Yannick Sinner. John Stashtower, Bloomberg Sports, Karen Nathan.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager. President Biden is blasting the Supreme Court's final decision of its term, giving presidents some immunity from criminal prosecution over official acts.
This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent, because the power of the office will no longer be constrained by the law, even including the Supreme Court of the United States.
And in remarks last night from the White House, the president said the decision now leaves voters with a choice whether former President Donald Trump's actions on January 6th make him unfit to return to the White House. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Kevin Whitelaw, who covered Washington for more than 2 decades. Kevin, good morning. This decision obviously does have far-reaching consequences when it comes to the power of the presidency, but this president really seems to be hoping that it reframes the stakes of this year's race as well.
Well, I think he's sort of making about the only argument he can at this point. This really is a blow to Democrats' hopes that the legal process would continue to sort of catch up with Donald Trump. The sort of delays the remaining cases likely through, past the election date. And so that sort of leaves Biden with only one remaining argument. And I do think the sweep of this ruling, even though obviously it's essentially kicking the case, the main case against Trump back to the court for some more review, it still basically is sweeping enough that it does say the president has pretty unlimited authority to do anything that's considered an official act. And, sort of, I think has a lot of people hearkening back to the Richard Nixon remarks years ago about, if the president does it, by definition, it's not a crime. That's pretty close to what the Supreme Court just said.
So then I guess it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that following the high court's decision, the president's legal team went right back up to New York and said, we need to toss out the hush money convictions as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense. They've made the argument before. They'll make it again. I think that one's a little harder to make because obviously a lot of the actions came before the election. But there were some of the documents involved in the case and some of the checks were cut after, after he took office. So it's going to be a little hard to call that part of the official acts of being president. But that's obviously not going to stop him from trying.
And obviously the president is hoping that this decision takes some of the focus off his debate performance and the questions about his age and mental fitness raised once again following that really rough performance for him last week. Does that do that?
Well, I think it's probably the only play he has, and it was probably always his best play, frankly, is essentially making this into an anti-Trump versus Trump kind of performance. I do think that, we've seen that in 2020, the anti-Trump vote was a very motivated vote and could well be again. And certainly this does reframe once again that sort of remark that Trump had made at one point about wanting to be a dictator on at least day one. I do think that you put those two things together, and that this does frame it in pretty sharp relief. We still have several months to go in the election. Biden could still bounce back from that performance, and this may be about the only path he has to try to convince voters to actually turn out and cast a vote for him.
It's interesting, Kevin, following the debate performance, we've got this reporting from Bloomberg News that the Democratic National Committee is thinking of nominating President Biden early, and at the same time, the Biden campaign is saying it just had its best fundraising month yet, despite the debate performance. I mean, where do things stand now with the Biden campaign?
Well, look, I think that what the Biden campaign has, quietly understood that the question of the president's age was always the biggest question, and so a certain amount of the belief about whether or not Biden is too old or is still fit to be president, a lot of that was baked in, and one debate performance may not change that. To me, I think it was more a matter of the debate had been a chance for Biden and his campaign to reshape that narrative to sort of say, no, let's move past this. Well, obviously they can't move past that, and so that's going to leave them focusing their best efforts on trying to frame this as, hey, look, if you don't want Trump, there's only one choice, and that's Joe Biden. And by making an early nomination, that would be one way to at least quell some of the conversation out there about whether Democrats are in fact maneuvering or should maneuver to replace him.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, SiriusXM, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.